today on Security Reviews, we're going to be configuring and reviewing the Revo America 4K turret camera with motorized lens, the 4K bullet camera with motorized lens, as well as the 4K 16-channel NVR. So, let's get started.
The items were shipped quickly and they arrived in 2 large boxes. For this system I purchased everything separately, which included 8 bullet cameras, 7 turret cameras, 1 16-channel NVR, and 1 Revo America yard sign, because why not? I'll leave the product numbers and links for every item I bought in the video description below. Let's start with the NVR. From a hardware perspective, the NVR has 16-channel inputs, 1 RJ45 port, a VGA port, and 2 HDMI ports, one of which outputs at 4K resolution. It also has 2 USB 2.0 ports in the front and 1 USB 3 ports in the rear, which makes it fast to back up files from the NVR or upgrade the NVR via flash drive. It also features an alarm in and out ports. Mine is configured with one 8TB hard drive, however the NVR supports up to 4 8TB hard drives for a total of 32 TB of storage. It also conforms to ONVIF, which allows you to connect third-party cameras and can record up to 12 megapixel resolution. One nice thing that I was not expecting is that the NVR is rack mountable and included the mounting brackets. So I used those and mounted them to my network rack, which took up 2U of space. Before I dive into a thorough review of the software on the NVR, let's talk about the cameras first. As for the cameras, they are pretty much identical cameras except for the obvious shape, and the bullet cameras does not have built-in audio natively with an RJ45 cable. You would need additional wires in order to accomplish that. Also, the bullet camera comes with 5 wires connected to it altogether, which includes an option for alarms and audio. Both cameras have motorized lenses, which can be adjusted from the NVR or through the camera's web application from 2.8mm to 12mm. The image qualities on these are 4K and as expected are pretty amazing. One thing to note about the cameras, when you log into the NVR for the first time with the default credentials, it prompts you to change your password. However, if you were to simply plug the cameras into the NVR itself and have the system connect to the cameras, you don't necessarily have to access the cameras directly, which means that you would have default credentials on the cameras unless you are actually authenticate into the cameras and change the password from the default. So I would make sure that you don't forget to do that part. To view the live feed from the web application, you can proceed to the internal IP address of the NVR and enter in the credentials. Once authenticated, you are directed to the live view page by default. From there, you have an option of which cameras you want to view, and to view them you can simply click on the camera's names. Now this looks like the same camera, but I have 3 different cameras mounted next to each other. You have an option to change the grid view depending on how many cameras you have, what stream you would like to watch, primary or secondary, and it shows you the corresponding frames per second, as well as how much bandwidth is being used per camera. On the bottom right, you have an option to take a snapshot of the video, manually record the feed, digital zoom, pan, tilt, and zoom, if applicable, as well as enabling the audio of the camera and making the video full screen. Next I'll show you some of the configuration options you have within the NVR. To make changes, you can go to the Setup tab. From there, you can specify the device name of the NVR, device ID, and you can configure your default language. It also shows some basic information about the device, including serial number and firmware version. Within Preview, you can configure what you want the resolution output to be for each video output. As I mentioned earlier, only HDMI 2 has 4K resolution capabilities, so that is what I have it configured at. Next is the time, and that section is pretty self-explanatory. Next, you have DST and holiday scheduling, which can be used in another section of the configuration. For example, you can have the cameras trigger differently for when it is during a holiday schedule. Next, you have serial settings, and then security settings. Within the security section, you have a lot of options to choose from, which include IP address filtering, where you can specify a blacklist of IPs you don't want to access the NVR, or a whitelist for the opposite. You can also have an option to create a watermark content for each camera. There's an option for password mode, which is essentially a password complexity requirement. You can also enable HTTPS, which will then allow you to create a SSL certificate and will allow you to connect to the NVR via an encrypted connection. There's also OnVIF authentication settings. And next there's Telnet, which is interesting they gave you this option. I would have much rather have seen SSH here. It also has 802.1x authentication capabilities. And finally, it has ARP or Address Resolution Protocol cache poisoning protection. Next, we can go into the on-screen display settings under Camera. This gives you the ability to overlay information on the video output, such as the time, camera name, account of people it has seen, etc. Now, I have already configured this directly on the camera itself. That is why you are seeing some information twice when I enable it. However, if you plan on configuring everything from your NVR, this would be the place to do it. Another section is for the privacy mask. I can think of a few applications for this. First, one might be to cover up an alarm panel or an access panel where people would input their credentials and you wouldn't want that recorded. Another application might be to cover up windows of neighboring properties. The next section is my favorite of the system, VCA or Video Content Analysis. This is where all of the smart analytics happens, including face detection, intrusion detection, cross-line detection, etc. You can configure these for every capable camera you have connected. In my case, both of the Revo cameras had this capability, but the Amcrest camera did not. Another VCA option is for intrusion detection. You can configure this around a door or other area, and you can have it trigger if someone enters or exits the area. After that is cross-line detection, which does just that. Next is audio detection, and you can configure it so that it will trigger if there is a sudden rise in audio. Next is people counting, which does what it says, and you can even configure it to track a certain way. For example, if you notice the top right corner of my video feed, you can see I already had this enabled on the camera itself, and that it has accounted 4 people entering the door and 1 person exiting. There are also settings for defocus detection, scene change detection, auto tracking, which would be done by a pan-tilt zoom camera, which I don't have. Then there is an object left behind and object remove detection. Now I configured this on my camera itself and the NVR, and I cannot get this to trigger. I reached out to Revo support about this, and they said that they only support cross-line, intrusion detection, face counting, and people counting. Now let's take a look at some of the footage the system's recorded for when I set up VCA. This first clip is for line crossing, and as you can see, the system was able to tell that I crossed the line that I configured and that it successfully recorded it onto the system. This next clip is for intrusion detection. I have the area configured to trigger for when someone goes into this closet. What's nice is that the camera will record a few seconds prior to the actual triggering activity to show you more of the context of the clip. The third clip is configured for face detection. As you can see, it recorded me walking through the door and successfully identified me as a human and recorded my face. A nice feature of the face recording is that if you're looking on the NVR, you can see JPEGs of the faces it detected, and then you can review the particular footage if you see an unfamiliar face. In all 3 instances, the VCA worked as expected and provided me with a high-quality video recording. The next section is the network settings, which shows you your current TCP/IP settings for the NVR, as well as the default gateway within your network. You can also configure PPPoE, or point-to-point over Ethernet. Next is P2P, or peer-to-peer settings, which is how you can connect the cameras to the cloud. After that is dynamic DNS. And the next section is the port section, where you can configure your ports for each protocol. Next is port mapping, then email settings. This is where you can input the SNMP server settings and have an email sent if something triggered, such as a loss of an input, etc. The next section is multicast, and after that is FTP. This is where you can specify a NAS or any FTP server to upload content to from your NVR. To do that, simply type in the IP address of your internal IP FTP server, specify the port, the username and password, and finally the remote directory on the server. Then you can click test, and if everything is entered incorrectly, you will receive a message saying connected to the FTP server. Next is the maintenance section, which is where you can view the log query of events from cameras such as motion detection events to NVR events such as FTP server connection events. Then you have HDD settings, which is where you can see information about your hard drive and to determine the status of them to determine if they are healthy. There's also a function which allows you to detect bad sectors within the hard drive as well. Next, you can see who is logged into the NVR, which shows the username that is signed in, their IP address, and the time they authenticated. Next is some network information which can use to troubleshoot if you are having issues on your network. You can also see the power over Ethernet status and see how much power each camera is consuming. After that is the camera, which shows you the status of each camera, followed by the recording section, which shows you information about each corresponding camera. Then there is maintenance, which has a restart button, which is nice if you have this in a network closet. You don't have to physically go into the rack to restart it, and it can be done remotely. You can also export the configuration file of the NVR so that if it ever gets corrupted, you can easily restore it back to the previous configuration without configuring every setting again. You also have the option to upgrade the system by downloading the files manually from their website, then uploading manually, or via the cloud if you have your system connected to the internet. There's also the ability to export diagnostic information for troubleshooting. From a software perspective, there are a lot of options that I like about the system. The VCA features work as expected. It has the ability to configure it with a network attack storage device. You can utilize other OnVIF compatible cameras, and it has some basic cybersecurity features built into it. The one downfall I found with the product was that you can enable Telnet rather than SSH. And what is interesting about that is if you try the default credentials of admin 123456, it doesn't work. However, a quick brute force discovered that the username and password for the system is root 123456, and there's no capability to change it. However, once connected, there is a limited shell, so there's only so much a would-be attacker could do if they were able to connect. However, I would recommend ensuring that you keep Telnet disabled. Overall, I am pleased with the quality of the cameras both from a hardware and image quality perspective, and I'm pleased with the NVR itself. I would recommend this system for advanced residential security or even commercial use you can take advantage of the expandable storage capabilities the NVR supports and the advanced VCA features. I'm looking forward to utilizing this system for years to come. Well, that pretty much wraps it up for this review. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and hit that subscribe button. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop them below and I'll try and address them. Have a good one.